Beecher and other Second Great Awakening reformers really disliked Andrew Jackson because the Democratic Party was slinging so much whiskey at voters, and because Northerners like Beecher are also going to decide slavery is wrong during the Second Great Awakening, wrong religiously. And Jackson's going to be on the wrong side of that issue for them. So yeah, this is what the Second Great Awakening wants to do. They want to improve U.S. public schools so they can Americanize immigrants and train people to be good Christian citizens. The key figure here is Horace Mann of Massachusetts. He was the superintendent of schools for the state back in the 40s and 50s, and he wasn't really a Second Great Awakening guy, but he was happy to use the energy and passion of the Second Great Awakening as leverage to improve schools in Massachusetts. The problem now Massachusetts already an educational leader, but Mann wants Massachusetts schools to be even better. The problem he sees is that teachers were at this point in history not professionals. Anybody could be a teacher if you could read and write and reckon. If you could read and write and do math, you were considered qualified to teach. And so teaching was done by amateurs, and in some cases, those amateurs were naturals, and good things happened in the classroom, and kids learned. But sometimes those amateurs were not very good. Teachers were severely underpaid back then, and that also tended to diminish the quality of education. So, Mann wants to address that problem first. He's like, if we want good people to be teachers, we need to pay them decently. And under Mann, teacher pay does improve. It's still not very good compared to other professions in the 1800s. Teacher pay is still not very good in a lot of states. In this state, in recent years, teacher pay has gotten better, still lagging behind professionals with comparable levels of education, but Mann was on the right track. When they improved pay for teachers, they got better people in classrooms. Second, better curriculum. Now, curriculum is a fancy word for the stuff kids need to learn. It is the knowledge and skills that kids are supposed to learn in school. Before the Second Great Awakening, there really wasn't a curriculum. The curriculum was whatever the teacher felt like teaching. And again, teachers were underpaid amateurs before the Second Great Awakening, so they're teaching whatever they feel like, which is usually, some reading and writing and math. And, sometimes these amateurs were making good decisions about what to teach, and other times they were making not so great decisions. So Mann has this idea. He's like, what if we get college-educated experts to figure out what knowledge and skills we want kids to learn at different grade levels, and what it's going to take to get kids ready for the workforce in the 1840s and later on in the 1850s, right? The idea is you update the curriculum as times change, right? So the state of Massachusetts would define teaching standards, and learning goals, and then the teachers would have a guidebook. They'd have a game plan to follow, and you could develop textbooks to help teachers teach and to help students learn, and this is what happens. Finally, Mann doesn't want amateurs in the classroom anymore. He wants teachers to get training. Massachusetts sets up normal schools, which is what they called teacher colleges back then. So normal schools aren't like schools for kids. Normal schools are teacher colleges for adults who want to be teachers. And so Massachusetts introduces this new requirement that if you want to teach school, you got to go to the normal school. You got to go to the teacher college. You need to finish the program, and then you will be regarded as qualified to teach. Folks, Horace Mann, with these reforms, basically invented public schools as we know them today, right? I mean, this is how schools work now. There's a state-approved curriculum, and teachers have to, you know, go through professional training. They have to go to college. They need to be qualified to take the job. So teaching is now a profession. Well, I mean, it was becoming a profession there because that's what man did. Anyhow, also, man says 2 or 3 years of education, not going to cut it. Every community needs to offer public school to kids up to age 16. Now, that doesn't mean that all kids have to stay in school until age 16. In fact, most didn't. Most dropped out and went back to work on the farm. But man believes that every community needs to let kids who want to stay in school until age 16 do so. And so while most kids continue to drop out after, getting basic reading, writing, and math, kids could stay in. Now, this is important because this new rising middle class, these middle class jobs require a higher level of education. And so middle class families can keep their kids in school so they gain those skills and are ready to be in the middle class like their parents. Also, lower income families, if they can swing it and they want their kids to be, to do better than they can, make sacrifices to keep their kid in high school so their kid could join the middle class. The sacrifice, of course, would public schools are free. The sacrifice would be not having your kid at home working, right? It's the loss of labor, an economic sacrifice, a strategic one, right? It's an investment. Then and now, the more education you have, the better the job you're going to be able to find, and generally speaking, the higher the pay you're going to get. Now, man wants these new public schools to be non-sectarian, and this is where it becomes clear that he's not really a Second Great Awakening guy, because most of the Second Great Awakening reformers would have been fine if these schools had been evangelical indoctrination centers full-time. But man says, that's a bad idea. Sure, it's okay for people to read the Bible in school. Yeah, it's okay for teachers to lead students in prayer. Those things were standard back then. But man suggests that schools should not be specifically just one kind of Christian, right? I mean, he's like, so we make schools non-sectarian, sort of generically Protestant, but not specifically evangelical or specifically Congregationalist or Puritan or anything else. Man pointed out that if you do that, right, if you are heavy-handed with your religious programming, then you're going to drive out kids. You're going to, one of the goals, of course, of these schools is to get the immigrants to be less Catholic, and man feels like you can do that with this sort of vanilla Protestant approach, but that if you went evangelical on all the school kids, then that's going to drive out the non-evangelical Protestants and maybe the Catholics. So I wish I could tell you that man's suggestion that schools be non-sectarian was followed faithfully. It was not. Generally, the religious programming in public schools reflected the local community. That is the majority in the local community. So we will see, and we will, later in this course, that public schools became really hard for Catholic families to cope with, and that so like man had the right idea, it was imperfectly and unevenly followed. Man's last major reform suggestion was that they stop beating children in school. Back then, beating kids was the go-to discipline method. They also did some humiliation of children. Man was against that too. Man recognized that both the humiliation and the beatings of children tended to turn kids off on education, make them dislike school, make them stop coming to school. And so he pointed out that these were backward practices, and that schools should stop doing them. This one was almost totally ignored. They kept humiliating and beating kids in school, even after the Second Great Awakening. Maybe they did it less because man told them not to do it at all, but these practices of humiliation and physical punishment would continue into the 20th and even the 21st century. There are many states where it is still legal to spank kids in school. They tend to be the former slave states, awkwardly. But man's other suggestions, right? Nobody's listening on corporal punishment. But his suggestions about professionalizing teaching and offering school up to age 16 and having schools be generally non-sectarian, these ideas are adopted beyond Massachusetts, really across the North. The South, not so much interested in this stuff. Consider that the high school concept is really aimed at preparing people for a middle class that doesn't exactly exist in the South, right? Because the Southern economy is not being transformed the way the Northern economy is. There's no factories in the South, really. So anyhow, that's the Second Great Awakening. Public education. Second Great Awakening also changes how evangelicals think about slavery. Let's start in the South. Before the Second Great Awakening, Southerners thought of slavery as a necessary evil. They recognized that slavery was bad and kind of brutal, but they argued that black people were evil and violent, and that slavery was the only way to keep them under control. If freed from slavery, black people would hurt white people. Black people would hurt one another. So they thought slavery was the only way to keep black folks safe from one another, and the only way to keep white people safe from black people. Well, admitting that slavery is bad makes it, a problem in the Second Great Awakening, because good Christians don't put up with evil, necessary or unnecessary. So Second Great Awakening is forcing Southern evangelicals to think about slavery in a new way, and they do. Second Great Awakening teaches that in the South that slavery is a positive good. Slavery is sacred. It's holy. It's God's plan. Here's Richard Furman, one of many Southern evangelicals who preached this particular teaching. They argued that black people were created by God as natural servants for white people. They believed that that was their purpose on earth, and that black people were really only happy in slavery, serving white people, because that's when they're executing God's design. And if freed from slavery, then blacks would be confused and possibly violent, right? So here they have, sort of said, black people aren't necessarily bad. They're good if they're in slavery, but dangerous if they're out of slavery. They also argued that slavery was good for white people. They argued that slave owners were even better Christians than people who didn't own slaves, because everybody takes care of their own family, everybody loves their own family, but slave owners, they argued, have a sort of bonus family of the slaves they own, people that they care for, and people that they want to bring to Jesus. So that is the message of the Second Great Awakening on slavery in the South.